My wife stood in our kitchen on a Tuesday morning in October, her hands wrapped around a mug of chamomile tea, and told me she was pregnant. She smiled when she said it. That slow, careful smile she used when she was managing a situation instead of living in it. The kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes. I'm an OB/GYN. I've delivered over 2,000 babies in Phoenix. I know exactly how conception timelines work down to the week, sometimes down to the day. And I knew, standing there in my own kitchen, holding my own coffee, that the baby she was carrying was not mine. Because the math didn't work. It couldn't work. Not with my schedule. Not with hers. But here's the thing she didn't know. The thing that would unravel everything she thought she'd carefully arranged. I had already been 3 steps ahead of her for 6 weeks. My name is Dr. Brennan Calloway. I'm 46 years old. I'm a board-certified OB/GYN at Desert Ridge Medical Center in North Phoenix, Arizona. I have privileges at 2 hospitals, a practice that took me 15 years to build, and until 8 weeks before that Tuesday morning in October, I believed I had a marriage worth protecting. This is the story of how I discovered that the 2 people I trusted most in the world had been betraying me, and how a single medical fact, the kind of fact I've spent my career explaining to other people, became the thing that changed everything. Before I get any further, if this kind of story is what brought you here, real, raw, the kind of thing that actually happens to real people, hit that subscribe button right now. I'll be here every week with stories exactly like this one. Drop a comment below telling me what you think Lacey's face looked like when she finally understood that I already knew, and if you know someone who needs to hear this story, share it with them. Now let's get into it. I need to take you back to the beginning, because none of this makes sense without context. Lacey and I met at a fundraiser for Valleywise Health in downtown Phoenix 11 years ago. She was 31 then, working as a senior event coordinator for a high-end hospitality company. She was exactly the kind of woman who could walk into a room full of surgeons and hospital administrators and make every single one of them feel like the most important person she'd ever met. That was her gift. And for a long time, I thought that gift was something she reserved for the people she genuinely cared about. We got married 2 years after we met, in a ceremony at the Arizona Biltmore in the spring. Lacey planned every detail herself. The color palette, the florals, the lighting. She was extraordinary at it. I stood at the altar watching her walk down the aisle and genuinely believed I was the luckiest man in the building. For the first 7 years we were solid. Not perfect. Nobody is. But solid. I worked long hours. She understood. She traveled frequently for work. Destination weddings, corporate retreats, galas. I understood. We had a rhythm. We had a life in our house in the Arcadia neighborhood, a beautiful place with a pool and a lemon tree in the backyard that Lacey planted the first spring after we moved in. The cracks appeared slowly, the way they always do. About 2 years ago, Lacey's social circle started shifting. She'd always had close friends, but she began spending more and more time with a specific group of women she'd met through a charity board she joined. The Camelback Women's Foundation. Wealthy women, most of them. Wives of developers, executives, one orthopedic surgeon whose practice made mine look like a lemonade stand. The kind of women who went to Scottsdale restaurants where a bottle of wine cost what most people paid for a car payment. The one who became Lacey's closest friend in that group was a woman named Diane Forsyth. Diane was everything Lacey had quietly always wanted to be. Old money beautiful. Effortlessly composed. Married to a man named Greg Forsyth, who ran a commercial real estate development company with offices in Phoenix, Scottsdale, and Dallas. Greg Forsyth was the kind of man who showed up at charity galas in a perfectly tailored suit and talked about his portfolio the way other men talked about the weather. Casual. Comfortable. Like success was simply the weather pattern of his life. Lacey adored Diane, and through Diane, she began spending more time around Greg. I told myself it was nothing. They were friends. Couples friends. We had dinner with them at Cartwright's Sonoran Ranch out in Cave Creek one evening in July. Drinks at a rooftop bar in Old Town Scottsdale. I sat across from Greg Forsyth and talked about interest rates and real estate development, and thought he was perfectly fine. Charming in that practiced way that successful men often are. I didn't feel threatened. I felt, if anything, slightly bored. That was my first mistake. Underestimating what was happening right in front of me. The girls' trip was Diane's idea. She proposed it in February. A long weekend in San Diego, she said. Just the women. A group of 6 from the Camelback board, including Lacey. The Pendry Hotel in downtown San Diego, which, if you don't know it, is not a place anyone goes to sit quietly and read paperbacks. It's rooftop pools and craft cocktails and the kind of environment designed specifically to make people feel like their regular lives are too small. Lacey was excited about it in a way that was almost too bright. She talked about it for 2 weeks before they left, showed me the hotel website on her phone, described the restaurants they were going to, asked if I thought a new dress for the trip would be reasonable. I said yes. I told her to have a great time. I meant it. They left on a Thursday in the second week of March, all 6 of them on a direct flight from Sky Harbor out of Terminal 4. I drove Lacey to the airport myself and kissed her at the departure's drop-off. She squeezed my hand before she got out of the car. I drove home and worked that whole weekend. 2 deliveries on Friday night, a complicated presentation for a continuing education seminar I was giving the following week. I texted Lacey both mornings and she responded with photos. Poolside drinks. A group dinner at some place with dim lighting and beautiful plating. Smiling faces. Everything looked exactly like what it was supposed to look like. They came back on a Sunday evening. I was in the living room when Lacey walked in, tan and relaxed, her carry-on rolling behind her. She hugged me, told me she'd missed me, poured a glass of water, and went upstairs to unpack. And that was that. That was the entire story, as far as I knew. Until it wasn't. 3 weeks after the San Diego trip, I ran into a colleague at Desert Ridge. Dr. Paula Whitfield, a cardiologist whose husband played in the same monthly poker game as Greg Forsyth. We were in the elevator together heading up to the 3rd floor when she mentioned, completely in passing, that she'd heard Greg had been in San Diego the same weekend as our wives' group trip. She said it the way people say things they assume you already know. "Funny coincidence, right?" she said. Though knowing Greg, I'm not sure it was a coincidence. The elevator doors opened. She got off. I stayed on, riding up another floor I didn't need to go to, trying to process what she'd just said. Greg Forsyth had been in San Diego, the same weekend. I went back to my office and sat at my desk for a long time. I thought about every moment of the week since Lacey had returned from that trip. The way she'd been slightly quieter than usual, the way she checked her phone with a little more frequency, the way she'd been unusually attentive, making dinners she didn't normally make, asking about my days with a little more care than usual. I'd read it as her being refreshed from the trip, present, the way vacations sometimes made people present. Now I was reading it differently. I'm a physician. I don't make diagnoses without data. I don't act on intuition alone. So I didn't confront Lacey. I didn't call Greg Forsyth. I didn't do anything dramatic. Instead, I started paying attention. Not in a paranoid way. In a clinical way. The same way I approach a complicated case. Gather data. Observe patterns. Let the evidence tell the story without imposing a narrative on it. What I found over the next 3 weeks was a pattern that only made sense one way. Text messages she angled away from me. A car charger in her bag for a phone I didn't recognize as hers. A dinner she said she had with a vendor from work on a Wednesday night that, when I mentioned it to her the following week, she slightly misremembered the details of. Small things. Individually, nothing. Together, a mosaic. I also did something I'm not proud of, but I'd do again. I called the Pendry Hotel in San Diego. I didn't lie, exactly. I said, I was checking on a charge that had appeared on a card linked to the reservation under the name Forsyth, a billing inquiry. The woman at the front desk was helpful in the way that hotel staff are trained to be. She confirmed that a reservation under that name had included a suite. She mentioned, without being asked, that the suite had accommodated 2 guests. 2 guests. Greg Forsyth had not been alone in San Diego. I sat in my car in the parking garage beneath Desert Ridge Medical Center for 17 minutes after I made that call. Then I went upstairs and delivered a baby, because that's what I was scheduled to do, and the baby didn't care about my personal life. That was 6 weeks before the Tuesday morning when Lacey told me she was pregnant. 6 weeks during which I had been thinking, calculating, preparing. Not out of vengeance, that's not who I am, but out of the deep, bone-level certainty that I needed to understand the full picture before I took a single step, because whatever I did next was going to change the course of both our lives. I am an OBGYN. I understand better than most people what a pregnancy means in terms of timing. The average gestational cycle runs approximately 40 weeks from the last menstrual period. First trimester detection via home test is typically possible 4 to 5 weeks post-conception. When Lacey came to me that Tuesday morning in October with her careful smile and her chamomile tea, I listened to her tell me she'd taken a test that morning and that we were expecting, and I did something I'm still slightly in awe of myself for. I smiled back. "That's incredible," I said. "How far along do you think you are?" She said she wasn't sure. Maybe 5 or 6 weeks, she thought. "We should schedule an ultrasound." I agreed that we should. I did the math in my head while I stood there looking at her. I'm very fast at this kind of math. I do it dozens of times a week. 5 to 6 weeks back from October put conception in early to mid-September. Early to mid-September. The San Diego trip had been in March. But that wasn't the issue. The issue was something else. Something I hadn't told Lacey. Something she had no way of knowing. In late July, I had undergone a vasectomy. I need to explain how that happened because I know how it sounds. I hadn't told Lacey I was planning it. We'd had conversations over the years, not arguments, just conversations, about whether we wanted children. We'd been somewhat ambivalent. Neither of us had pushed hard in either direction. As I got older and the demands of my practice grew, I had quietly, gradually made peace with the idea that we wouldn't have kids. I thought Lacey felt the same. She'd never pressed the issue. In July, during a routine medical review, my own physician and I discussed it. I made the decision. I scheduled the procedure. I told myself I'd talk to Lacey about it when the moment felt right, that it wasn't a unilateral decision so much as a personal health decision I'd finally made. I was going to tell her. I was figuring out how. And then I found out about San Diego. And then I said nothing about the vasectomy. I let it sit there, quiet, like a sealed envelope in a drawer. When Lacey told me in October that she was pregnant, I understood immediately and completely what I was looking at. She had been with someone else. The child she was carrying was not mine. And she either didn't know that I knew, or she was betting on the odds that I'd simply believe it was mine because why would she think otherwise? She was betting on trust. On the 15 years of trust we had built together. She was using my trust against me like a tool. Standing there in my kitchen that Tuesday morning, I made a decision. I was not going to hand her the sealed envelope yet. I went to work that day as usual. I saw patients. I reviewed charts. I sat in my office at lunch and made a phone call to an attorney named Shelby Hartman, who my colleague Rowan Decker had used 2 years prior for a property dispute that had gotten complicated. I knew Shelby was thorough. I knew she was discreet. I explained my situation to Shelby in broad strokes. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Dr. Calloway, before we talk next steps, I want to ask you something. Do you have documentation of the vasectomy?" I told her I did. Procedure records, follow-up confirmation of a successful outcome, all of it in my own medical file. She said, "Good, then the timeline will be medically verifiable. That's important." We talked for 40 minutes. Shelby was not an emotional person. She was precise and procedural, which is exactly what I needed. She outlined what I was looking at in terms of dissolution of assets, what Arizona law said about marital property, what we would need to establish and when. I left that conversation with a clear picture of my next 6 weeks. Lacey, meanwhile, was planning. I could see it in the way she was moving through our days. She was softer with me, more present, making small gestures. She suggested we go to dinner at a place we used to love in downtown Scottsdale, a farm-to-table restaurant on Brown Avenue that we hadn't been to in probably 2 years. I said yes. We went. I sat across from her and talked about her sister's upcoming visit and an article I'd read about water conservation in the valley and whether we should repaint the exterior of the house before summer. She reached across the table at one point and held my hand. "I feel really good about this," she said, meaning the pregnancy, meaning us. I looked at her hand over mine, her fingers, the ring I'd put on her finger in a garden at the Arizona Biltmore. "Me too," I said. The call from Diane Forsyth came on a Thursday afternoon in the 3rd week after Lacey told me. I was between appointments when her name appeared on my cell phone. Diane had my number from various group texts and event coordination conversations over the years. She and I were cordial. Not close, but cordial. I answered. She said she needed to talk to me. Her voice was tight, controlled in the way that people control their voices when they are very close to losing it. I said, "Okay." She said she'd found out. About Greg. About San Diego. About all of it. I said, "Diane, I think we need to have this conversation in person." We met at a coffee shop on Camelback Road the following morning, a Saturday. She arrived before me, sitting in a corner booth with a coffee she wasn't drinking, her hands flat on the table in front of her. Diane Forsyth was a composed woman. I had always thought of her as almost architecturally composed. But sitting across from me that morning, she looked like a building that had lost its load-bearing walls. She had found messages on Greg's phone. She didn't go into detail about how. She just said she'd found them, and that the messages made clear that San Diego had not been a coincidence, that it had been planned, that there had been other times and other places before San Diego, that it had been going on for months. I told her I knew, or suspected. I told her what I'd found and what I'd calculated and what I hadn't yet told Lacey. Diane stared at me. "Lacey is pregnant," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," I said. "She told me 3 weeks ago." The silence that followed was very long. "Greg doesn't know yet," Diane finally said. "Or if he does, he hasn't told me. He's been trying to explain the messages. He's been saying it was nothing. He's been doing what men do when they get caught, which is lie with decreasing conviction." I asked her what she wanted to do. She said she didn't know. She said she'd been awake for 4 nights. She said she kept thinking about her daughter, who was 9, and her son, who was 12, and what this was going to do to them. I told her that was the first thing I'd thought about, too. We talked for 2 hours. We did not cry, either of us. We were, I realized, 2 people in shock trying to behave like people who were not in shock, and doing a reasonable job of it. When we left, Diane stopped at the door. "When are you going to tell Lacey you know?" "Soon," I said. She nodded. "I'm going to tell Greg tonight that I know everything. I think you should know that." "I appreciate it," I said. She left. I sat in my car in the parking lot for a while, watching a group of teenagers on bikes cross Camelback against the light. Normal Saturday morning in Phoenix. Somebody's husband was about to find out his wife knew. Somebody's wife was in my house right now, probably at the kitchen table with her tea, not knowing that the 2 quiet conversations happening around her were about to become a very loud one. Lacey was at her yoga class when Greg called my cell phone that Saturday afternoon. I picked up. He said, "I think we should talk." I said, "I agree." He said, "Diane told you." I said, "Diane confirmed what I already knew." Another silence. Greg Forsyth was a man who controlled rooms, who controlled deals, who controlled the temperature of conversations. He did not have that control now, and I could hear him working to find it. "Brennan," he said, "I don't know what to say to you except that I'm sorry." "I don't need your apology," I said. "What I need is clarity about one thing." He asked what. "The pregnancy," I said. "Are you aware of it?" A pause that lasted just a beat too long. "Lacey mentioned it to me this week, yes." She had told him. Before she had fully committed to the story she was presenting to me, she had told him. She had been managing both of us simultaneously. "Then you should know," I said, "that there are going to be some medical realities that come to light in the course of this. I want you to be prepared for that." He started to say something. I told him I had nothing further to discuss with him personally, and that any communication from this point forward should go through my attorney. Then I ended the call. I went back inside and started making dinner. Lacey came home from yoga 40 minutes later, hair damp, skin flushed, carrying that particular brightness she had after a workout. She kissed my cheek. She asked what I was making. She set her bag down and poured a glass of water. Normal. Everything completely normal. I thought about the lemon tree in the backyard she had planted the first spring after we moved in. I thought, not yet. The conversation with Lacey happened on a Sunday morning 2 weeks later. I had planned it, not scripted it. I'm not that kind of person, but planned it. I knew what I needed to say and in what order. I had spoken with Shelby twice more. I had all the documentation I needed. I was ready. Lacey was at the kitchen table with her tea. The Sunday morning light was coming through the sliding door that opened to the backyard, and the lemon tree was visible from where she sat. She was reading something on her phone. Everything was quiet. I sat down across from her with my coffee. She looked up and smiled. "Can I talk to you about something?" I said. She said, "Of course." "I need to talk to you about the pregnancy." The smile didn't leave her face immediately. It took 2 or 3 seconds to process that something in my tone wasn't right. It faded the way a signal fades when you drive out of range. Not all at once, just gradually until it's gone. "What about it?" she said. "I need to ask you something directly, and I need you to answer me honestly." She set down her phone. She wrapped both hands around her mug. "Brennan, what's wrong?" "Lacey," I said. "Whose baby is it?" The freeze happened exactly the way I expected it to. I've seen that particular kind of stillness before. In patients who've just received information that their bodies haven't yet processed. In people who are running calculations at high speed, while their exterior does its best to appear normal. Every physician learns to recognize it. Her face froze. "What are you talking about?" she said. Her voice was carefully, precisely even. "I'm an OB/GYN, I said. "I know how to read a timeline. I also had a vasectomy in July, which means the baby you're carrying is not mine." The color left her face in a way I can only describe as complete. Like a light switching off. She stared at me. She didn't speak. I watched her try to find a version of this conversation that led somewhere survivable and come up empty. "I've already spoken with an attorney," I said. "Shelby Hartman's office. She specializes in high-asset divorce in Arizona, and she's been very helpful. I've also had a conversation with Diane Forsyth, who you may want to know has been aware of the situation for several weeks." Lacey set her mug down on the table. Her hands were shaking. Not dramatically, but visibly. "Brennan," she said. Her voice broke on my name. Just slightly. One clean fracture. "I'm not going to do this as a confrontation," I said. "I'm going to tell you what's going to happen, and I'm going to ask you to respond with honesty, because I think we've both earned at least that much." She nodded. A very small nod. "What's going to happen is that we are going to dissolve this marriage. Shelby has already started the paperwork. Arizona is a community property state, so that process will be straightforward. The house will need to be handled, but she's confident in the outcome. I'm not going to make this ugly. That is not what I want. What I want is to understand how we got here." Another long silence. Outside, a mockingbird started its routine in the lemon tree. I heard it clearly. "How long?" I asked. She looked at her hands. 8 months. 8 months. That was longer than San Diego. That was before San Diego. San Diego had been, what? A watershed moment? A step from covert to something more openly real? "Did you love him?" I asked. She looked up at me then. Her eyes were wet, but she wasn't crying. She was holding it by sheer will. "I thought I did," she said. "I think I was confused about what I was feeling." "And now?" "He ended it," she said, "after Diane found out. He ended it and told me I was on my own." Greg Forsyth, the man in the perfectly tailored suit with the casual relationship to success, had cut and run the moment his own world was threatened. I felt something in my chest that I can only describe as grief with no specific target. Not for her, not for myself, for all of it, for the lemon tree, for the Arizona Biltmore, for every ordinary Sunday morning that had existed before this one and would never exist in quite the same way again. "I need you to understand something," I said. "I have been careful, and I have been fair, and I have done this in the way that I think gives both of us the most dignity. But I will not stay in this marriage. That is not something I'm open to discussing." She didn't argue. I think some part of her had known, from the moment I sat down, that there was no argument to make. "What about, she started. "The baby is yours," I said. "Whatever choices you make about that are yours to make. I am not in a position to be involved in that situation, and I don't think it would serve anyone for me to try." She put her face in her hands, not dramatically, just quietly, like someone putting down a very heavy thing. I stood up. I took my coffee to my office. I had patient notes to review because Monday was coming regardless of what had happened in my kitchen, because that was the nature of the work I had chosen, and for the first time in months I was grateful for it. Grateful for the relentless forward motion of a practice that demanded all of me and gave me no room to stand still in my own wreckage. The next 3 months were the practical months. Shelby Hartman was, as advertised, extremely thorough. The dissolution was filed in November. By Arizona standards, the process was relatively clean. The Arcadia house went to Lacey in exchange for a buyout over the equity I'd contributed since we'd purchased it. My retirement accounts and practice assets were separately categorized. We did not fight over furniture. We did not fight over the car or the joint savings or the vacation property we'd briefly considered in Sedona before deciding it wasn't practical. We were, in the strange way that people who have loved each other and then broken each other can be, civil. I moved into a rental house in the Biltmore area in December. I liked the neighborhood, liked the quiet streets and the mature trees, and began the work of building something that was entirely mine. Not smaller exactly, different, quieter in ways that were sometimes hard and often not. Diane Forsyth filed for divorce from Greg the same week Lacey and I did. She took the children to her sister's place in Tempe for a month while the initial proceedings sorted themselves out. I saw her once in January at a coffee shop near the medical center. She looked tired but steadier than she had in the corner booth on Camelback Road. We talked for about 20 minutes. We were not close friends, would probably never be close friends, but there was an understanding between us that didn't require words. We were two people who had learned the same hard lesson from the same source, and we had both, in our own ways, gotten to the other side of it. Greg Forsyth, last I heard through the corridors of the various Phoenix social circles that overlapped between our lives, had retained an attorney and was contesting various elements of the asset division. I suspected he would find that Diane was a more formidable opponent than he had anticipated. She was the kind of woman who had spent years appearing composed and pliant while being, underneath, extremely precise. Lacey had the baby in the spring. A girl. I know this only because my attorney informed me of the birth as a procedural matter related to some lingering documentation in our dissolution. I did not send a card. I did not reach out. I wished her no harm. But there are doors that, once closed, don't need to be reopened. I want to tell you what I learned, because I think this story is worth more than the betrayal at its center. I spent a lot of time in those months of quiet preparation, the 6 weeks between knowing and telling, sitting with something that I don't think I'd ever properly examined. The question of what I had been willing to not see. I am a physician. I am trained to observe, to ask precise questions, to gather data without letting hope or preference distort what the data shows. And yet I had been, for months, choosing not to ask the questions that would have given me information I didn't want to have. I had known, on some level, that something was wrong. The year that preceded San Diego had been different in ways I had attributed to the natural friction of a long marriage, the ordinary distances that accumulate between two people whose lives are full of other demands. I had chosen that explanation because it was bearable. I had chosen the explanation that allowed me to go on. That's not unique to me. I see it in patients all the time. The woman who doesn't schedule the mammogram for 2 years because she's not ready for the results. The man who doesn't mention the pain in his chest because he's afraid of what it means. The human mind is extraordinary at protecting itself from information it's not ready to process. But here's what I've come to believe, sitting in my rental house in the Biltmore area on quiet evenings with a book and a glass of wine, and the kind of peace I hadn't felt in years. The information doesn't get better with delay. The truth doesn't become less true because you look away from it. And once you actually look at it, once you sit with the real, unedited facts of your situation, you find out what you're actually made of. I am an OB-GYN in Phoenix, Arizona. I have spent my career at the intersection of some of the most profound moments in human life. New life beginning, difficult news being delivered, families being formed and sometimes broken. I have sat with women in some of the hardest moments they will ever face and tried to give them both the truth and the tools to handle it. I thought I was good at that in my professional life. It took losing my marriage to understand that I needed to be equally willing to do it for myself. Last month, a resident who works with me at Desert Ridge, a sharp, exhausted third year named Kelsey Holt, came to my office and asked me something that I didn't expect. She'd heard, in the way that people in hospitals always eventually hear things, some version of what had happened to me over the past year. She wasn't asking for details. She was asking something simpler. She said, "How do you keep going when the ground drops out from under you?" I thought about it for a moment. Kelsey was 29. She was at the beginning of everything. She deserved a real answer. I said, "You do your work, not because the work will fix what's broken. It won't. But because the work reminds you who you actually are, separate from whatever is currently falling apart." The work is honest in a way that everything else sometimes isn't. And on the days when you can't figure out who you are outside of the wreckage, you can at least figure out who you are in the room with a patient who needs you. And that's enough to get through the day. And most of the time, getting through the day is enough. She nodded. She went back to her rounds. I turned back to my charts. Outside, through the window of my office, the Phoenix afternoon was doing what Phoenix afternoons do. Blazing, massive, indifferent to every small human drama playing out beneath it. The Sonoran Desert has been here for millions of years. The saguaros in the distance had survived droughts and floods and temperature extremes that would flatten most things. There's something stabilizing about that if you let yourself feel it. I let myself feel it. My name is Dr. Brennan Calloway. I'm 46 years old, and I'm an OBGYN in Phoenix, Arizona. 11 months ago, my wife told me she was pregnant with another man's child and believed I wouldn't know the difference. She was wrong about that. She was wrong because the truth, in medicine and in life, is not something you can successfully manage around. It finds its way out. It always does. The ground drops out from under you. And then, if you're paying attention, if you're willing to do the hard and unglamorous work of building something new, you find out what was underneath all along. Sometimes it's more solid than you thought. Sometimes it's exactly what you needed to find. You know what hit me hardest about this story? It wasn't the betrayal. It wasn't even the pregnancy. It was the 6 weeks he stayed quiet. 6 weeks of knowing and still showing up. Still being decent. Most people would have exploded on day one. And honestly, no one would blame them. But there's something different about a person who takes a breath before they blow everything up. Who makes sure they're standing on solid ground before they make their move. I think we all have moments where we find out something that could send us off the rails. The question is whether we react or whether we respond. Those are two completely different things. Anyway, that's just me. Tell me what you think in the comments. Would you have waited, or would you have confronted her the same night? I genuinely want to know. And if you're not subscribed yet, now's the time. Stories like this one every single week.